Hobbyist here, back at it again with another board game tutorial, and this time we are covering Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. Deception, Murder in Hong Kong is a social deduction game from 4 to 12 players that focuses around a crime scene. The biggest difference in comparison to any other social deduction game is that this game doesn't revolve around just vibe checking people and saying that you're the murderer because you seem suspicious. No, 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 no. In fact, not only do you have to be able to determine who the murderer is inside of Deception Murder in Hong Kong, but you also have to be able to correctly guess what their murder weapon and what their clue was at the same time. So it's an additional layer of information and deducing based on the clues that the forensic scientist will give to you throughout the game. So before we get any further into any of the other bits of details, let's go ahead and go over the teams and what exactly that they do. These are your investigators. The majority of what role that you're more than likely going to take on inside of Deception Murder in Hong Kong. The investigators don't independently have special abilities. However, their goal is to try to work out, based on the information given to them, who the murderer is and what weapon and what clue that he gave off. All of these guys are on the same team, and again, they're the majority of the players that you're gonna be picked from. Also serving alongside the investigators is the forensic scientist and the witness. Depending on the group and the level of players that you have, the witness can be substituted either with or for any of the other investigators. All that the witness does for his abilities is that he offers quite a bit of information for himself, because whenever the night of the crime takes place, the witness, when he wakes up, will know that one of two people are either the murderer or the accomplice, but he won't know which is which, nor will he know the solution to the crime. The forensic scientist, however, is the game master, whose goal is to help out the investigators with figuring out who the murderer is. But I'll explain more on the forensic scientist a bit later. We have the accomplice and the murderer. The murderer, obviously, is the bad guy. He's the one who did commit the crime. And the accomplice knows who the murderer is, as well as the solution to the crime. And he is trying to make sure that the murderer doesn't get caught, with one, knowing who he is, and two, that the solution to the crime isn't figured out. These red cards inside of Deception Murder in Hong Kong are the clues. It's also what we like to call the evidence that was left behind at the crime scene. In order to start your setup for a basic game of Deception Murder in Hong Kong, you're going to deal out 4 of these cards. Blue cards are what we call the murder weapons, or the means of the murder. And every player, when you set up, in addition to those 4 red cards of the clues, they're also going to get 4 blue cards. In the example that I'm going to have up here, I'm going to demonstrate what a 6-player game setup would look like. Even though I don't got them all on camera, this is essentially what it's going to look like. Now, whether you decide you want to put the clue cards on the top or the bottom is entirely up to you. You just got to make sure that with your group that everyone remains consistent and that it all looks uniform in a sense. But once all of the means of the murder cards, aka the blue cards, and the clue cards, the red cards, are all dealt out, then everybody is going to be secretly assigned a role. If you manage to get the forensic scientist card, then all of your cards in front of you can be put away. Last thing that you have to do is that, based on the number of players, everybody except for the forensic scientist is going to get 1 badge token. And this is going to become important later. For purposes of this demonstration, we're going to play with all of the role cards that are in this particular game face up. So that way it just makes it easier to explain. But otherwise, normally your role card would be kept face down for all intents and purposes. Switching over and kind of explaining the forensic scientist as you're playing from a forensic scientist point of view, what you have to set up is that all of these are your clue tiles, are bits of information that you're going to be able to give to the rest of your investigators, pointing in the direction of the murderer. So there's several of these in the stack, so you'll just take your time and shuffle these up and set them off to the side. If you want to make your game more interesting and you're more experienced with Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, you can also shuffle these 6 event tiles right into the game. With that being said, all you have to do next is tell everyone on the that is playing in the game that isn't you to go ahead and close their eyes as the night of the crime is going to begin. The first set of people that you're going to have wake up during the night of the crime is that you're going to ask the murderer to wake up. And if you're playing with an accomplice in your game and you have that big of a group, you're going to have the murderer and the accomplice wake up at the same time. What they're going to do is that the murderer and accomplice are going to recognize each other and know who each other are. But then, out of one of the blue cards and one of the red cards, the murderer is going to pick how he commits his crime. Let's say, just for the sake of this example, that he decides to go with the hook and paint as his solution to the crime. After the murderer and the accomplice successfully know who each other are, and the murderer picks his solution to the crime, only the forensic scientist, the murderer, and the accomplice will know the solution to the crime. However, the witness will wake up afterwards as soon as the murderer and the accomplice is told to close their eyes by the forensic scientist. Then at that point, the forensic scientist will point at the 2 people and narrow down the search of one person is the accomplice and one person is the murderer. Otherwise, in our smaller game scenario, it would be best to just leave out the witness and just keep another investigator. Once everybody wakes up, you are going to find these green clue tiles and these purple ones, and you're going to be able to select. This purple tile right here is going to sit out in front to where everybody who's playing the game is going to be able to see it, and that is going to list off your causes of death. These next 4 green tiles over here are all the locations possible, and you're going to be able to select one of them. In our case, we know that the hook and the paint is the solution to the crime. So as the forensic scientist, we're going to look through these, look through the locations, and kind of paint ourselves the picture of what the crime looked like. So we got to be able to make it easy to interpret that, okay, it's a hook. Where can you find a hook? You can find hooks at, say, a supermarket, because it might be in the fishing section of the supermarket, or something like that. Once you have done that, you will have selected one of those green locations, and then one of those purple locations, as well as drawn the top 4 tiles from your tile stack. Right here in my hand are the 6 bullets that the forensic scientist will use to help the investigators be able to discuss the information and the clues that you give. One key thing about the forensic scientist has to have a straight face the entire time he's playing the game. The forensic scientist can't point or gesture at the solution of the crime, and the only means of communication he has once the game starts is through the tile information. So as the forensic scientist, you got to be able to be creative enough with the vague information to help interpret the investigators towards that direction. So here's exactly what I mean. Whenever the forensic scientist is ready, he can give his starting information by placing the bullets on the names and locations of everything that is on the tiles to give the investigators the starting bit of information. Now, all the information that the forensic scientist is going to give and all the clues and murder weapons that are out here are open to interpretation. So for example, vaguely in the distance over here, we could see that the murderer's, one of his means is drowning. Now, it doesn't necessarily explain where the drowning could have taken place. If one of the clue locations said, like, a bathroom, it could have said a pool, it could have said in a river, it could have happened outdoors, it could have happened indoors. All of that is open interpretation and open information that you could come to the consensus of. The key thing as the murderers, and what you're going to know that the murderer is going to try to do, is he's going to try to pick things from his weapons and his clues that try to line up or are incredibly similar with other investigators to try to incriminate their information and to make them seem more suspicious. So here, in this particular example, the severe injury obviously is the hook, because even though it's the picture of a fishing hook, you could switch it to any other kind of hook. It could make it like a big hook, like a pirate hook. It could be a butcher hook that you see inside of butcher shops. All of the clues, even though they have images, are up to interpretation by the rest of the investigators. So you could say that the paint, as the clue that was in the park, it could have been mural paintings on the walls. It could have been painting on a canvas. It could have been spray paint instead of just regular paint. So you can have the investigators get as creative with their answers as they come up with. As the forensic scientist, you control the pace of the game. You can let the investigators throw back and forth their theories, their speculations, their ideas, and you're going to want to encourage them to think outside the box, because the answers are never always going to be straightforward. But over time, you're going to pick up your bullets, because you have 6 of them, and over time, when you feel that the discussion on one point's been going too long, or you think that the investigators don't have enough information, then we could do adding a bit more bullets at a time, to where maybe it might be something that could help out the investigators a little bit more. We could say that the paint would have been for money, because you sell paintings. Then we go on to the clothings. We could say that the clothes were a bit untidy. Or you could even say bizarre, like the artist is a little bit bizarre, because they always say that, so you can make that about paint. You can make the sudden incident be nothing. Nothing crazy happened. But once the forensic scientist places the last bullet on their 6 clue tiles, then the discussion phase ends, and we move on to presentations. Deception Murder in Hong Kong. Presentations is an exclusive phase to any other social deduction game, because a lot of times, a lot of social deduction games run into the problem of too many people talking over other people, or you have the quiet people who have something to say, but are otherwise overshadowed by everybody else. We know those types of gamers and those types of gaming groups. It happens pretty frequently. But in Deception Murder in Hong Kong, that fixes that case, because inside the presentation step, you can give about 30 seconds to a minute to every single player to immediately, without any interruptions whatsoever from any other player, to discuss their thought processes on the information that they've been given so far. So you can let Timmy over there in the corner, who hasn't said much the whole game because he feels he's been talked over, get all of his thoughts out, and to present his findings in his unique way of explaining the situation, to where he's considering severe injuries. Okay, we're also looking at that axe over there. You can cause some severe injuries with that. Or inside the park, we could find a map that's out in the park that gives you directions on what the park layout looks like, or something like that. And it gives every single person that 30 seconds to a minute to be able to discuss everything. Every single person is going to get that turn. The presentations are complete. There are 2 more rounds of evidence collecting for the investigation team to figure out. So all that you do is that you simply draw the next tile that is inside of your tile stack, and you take away any of the orange tiles, as the location of the crime and the cause of death will never change with every game in Deception Murder in Hong Kong, but you'll take any of the remaining 4 and take away the least useful information. Maybe something that you put down is very misleading to everybody else. So let's say, for example, that money is the most irrelevant one. Once you have taken that old tile out and replaced it with a new one, you should immediately place the bullet on there and give the investigators enough time to process the new information. And then, all that simply happens is that you'll repeat the phase again. You have presented all of that, then you'll give everybody 30 seconds to a minute to do their presentations, and then there is only one more round of evidence collection and presentations. After that final round, if the investigators at that point have not caught the murderer, then the murderer wins. If the murderer does get caught, and there's no other roles, then the investigators win. These are the badges. I mentioned that every player gets one, but why is that? Well, this actually comes important into how you're solving the crime in the first place. At any time during the whole 3 rounds of Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, you could do it from the first one in the jump, and is the only time that you can interrupt a presentation is if you decide that you want to solve the crime, then any player with their badge can hold their badge up in the air and say, I would like to solve the crime. The forensic scientist stops the game flow at that point, and then that player has the opportunity to then guess who the murderer is and what their blue weapon card and red clue card were. When it comes to answering as the forensic scientist, you can only ever give a yes or no response, even if half of the solution is correct. So in our example, if the hook was successfully guessed correctly, but then they said the mark, the whole answer is a no. There's no kind of, there's no you're half right. It's yes or no. And that's what keeps the investigators in the dark, to where they don't know if they were totally off the mark or if they were half right or anything of that situation. So that's something to keep in mind. If they lose the yes or no response, to where they get a no, then that player loses their badge for the rest of the game and can no longer make accusations. However, they can still continue to discuss and to play and to participate. They just have no ability to make an accusation any longer for the rest of the game. If you're playing with multiple people and the murderer and the witness are in the game, as well as the accomplice, the murderer has one last chance in order to escape and to win. If the murderer gets caught and he reveals himself to be the murderer and the investigator has successfully picked the weapon and clue, then the murderer and the accomplice work out who they think the witness is, and they guess that player. If they get it correctly and the witness gets killed, then the murderer and the accomplice escape and they win over all the investigators and the forensic scientist. While surviving 3 rounds of Deception, Murder in Hong Kong is a way that the murderer can win, if the murderer can successfully also make all the investigators lose their badges on incorrect guesses, then he also wins, because there's no way for the investigators to catch the murderer. So that's something else to keep in mind if you're the murderer or if you're the accomplice and trying to frame yourself. Otherwise, Deception in Hong Kong is probably my favorite brain teaser of a social deduction game, because again, it's not all about the vibe checks. It's not all about I get bad vibes from you, so let's vote him out specifically. There's concrete information that you're trying to puzzle together and work your way through. And that all of the information that's in the cards that are out on the table are all open to interpretation, like I mentioned before. So there's a lot of ways for the murderer to manipulate information to where he could say, yeah, I got a hook, but it's just a fishing hook. Or you could say something to the effect, well, it's something sharp and causes severe injury, but what about those pair of scissors that another player has? Or what about that drill? That drill can also cause severe injury, so how is my hook necessarily tied into that? It's a lot more of a logical step process. And like I said with the forensic scientist, because the forensic scientist is limited on communication and how he paints the picture of the crime scene, he has to get really creative and hope that his investigators pick up on the information that he's putting down. When it comes to the investigators, they got to be able to work all of this information out, talks amongst each other, and take advantage of those presentations. And to kind of decide for themselves, is this the right time that we should cash in our badges? Or should we wait until a little bit later on as we get more information? So that's all the balancing act that this game has, and I think it's really, really awesome for doing that. Otherwise, I thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you stuck all the way through, and I'll see you guys in the next video.